Now we're going to fetch the list of video games from the ROG API. So head over to rog.io. Up here, you can get an API key. It's free at the time of recording this video, and hopefully it's going to remain free for the future. If not, I'm really sorry about this. It's really outside my control. So create an account and sign up. It takes only a minute. Once you log in, you're going to see this page. So I'm currently on the free plan, and here are the number of requests I can send to this backend. Now down here, you will see your API key. Copy this back to our project. Now we should install Axios for sending HTTP requests. Good. Now we need to create an Axios instance with custom configuration. In that configuration, we are going to include the API key that we just copied. So back to our project, here in the source folder, let's add a new folder called services. Here we add a new file called api-client.ts. In this file, first we import Axios on the top. Then we call axios.create to create an Axios instance with a custom configuration. Here we set params to an object. In this object, we set the key to the value that we just copied. With this configuration, this key will be included in the query string of every HTTP request we send to our backend. Okay. Now we should also set the base URL here. So back to the ROG website. On the top, let's look at the API documentation. So here we should read the documentation. So here we have a bunch of different endpoints. In this lesson, we're going to send a request to the games endpoint. So here we can get a list of games. Here are our query parameters for filtering and sorting. We'll come back and revisit this part later in the course. Let's scroll down and see the full URL of our API endpoint. So look at the response. This is the object that is returned from the server. In this object, we have 4 properties: count, next, previous, and results, which is an array of game objects. Again, we'll come back and revisit this in this video. So scroll down. Here's the game's endpoint. If we click here, we can see the full URL. So we should grab this and use it as our base URL. We just need to remove /games. Okay. So here we have an Axios instance. Now we need to export it as a default object from this module. Good. Now let's create a new component called GameGrid. In this component, we need a state variable for storing our game objects. So use state. We're going to initialize this to an empty array. Then we get the games array and the function to update it. We also need a state variable for our error messages. I'm going to initialize this to an empty string and call it error. Next, we should use the effect hook to send a fetch request to the backend. So use effect. Here we pass a callback. In this function, we need to use our API client. So on the top, we import API client. Good. And then over here, we call API client.get. We send a request to the game's endpoint. Now, if everything goes well, we're going to grab the response and set the games to. Now, this is where we need to use TypeScript to define an interface that represents the shape of the response object. So earlier I told you that in the response we have these few properties. So let's create an interface that represents this response object. So back to our code. Here we define an interface called, we can call it fetch games response, or whatever you prefer. In the response, we're going to have a count property, which is a number. Now at the moment, I don't care about previous and next properties. These are links to fetch the games in the previous or next pages. So let's focus on what we really need for this lesson. What we need is the results property, which is going to be an array of game objects. So here we need to define another interface that represents our games. Let's look at what we have in the response. So if you click here, we can see that each game has properties like ID, slug, name, and so on. For this lesson, I just want to grab the ID and the name. We'll come back and add additional properties when we really need them. So we're not going to write code that we are not going to use, okay? So each game is going to have an ID that is a number and a name that is a string. With that, we can say the results property is of type game array. Now, when sending a GET request to the server, we use angle brackets to provide a generic type argument that is fetch game's response. With that, we know the shape of the response object. That is Axios response of type fetch game's response. So over here, if we type res dot, we can see the properties in the response that come with Axios. Here we need to access the data property, so we read the body of the response. And from here, we'll see the properties that come from our API. So we have count and results. So we can set the games to res.data.results. Now here we have a compilation error because we initialized our games to an empty array. So to solve this problem in angle brackets, we have to tell the TypeScript compiler that this is a game array. Okay, so this is the happy path. Now, what if we get an error? Here we call catch to get the error. And here we call set error to error.message. Okay. Now, for this lesson, we're not going to render our game cards with all the details like images and stuff. We just want to render a simple, unordered list to see if our implementation is correct. So down here, I'm going to add an unordered list. Next, we grab our games and map each game to a list item. Here we set the key to game dot. Now, because we're using TypeScript, we can see the properties of our game objects. So we set the key to game.id, and for the text, we render game.name. Now let's go to the app component and add our game grid in the main area. So I'm going to replace this with game grid. Okay, let's see if our application is working. So back in the browser, here are the games. Beautiful. Now, what if we get an error? We need to render that in our markup. So let's add a text component and render the error message. Now we want to render this only if we have an error. Now we have a compilation error because we have multiple elements and we need to wrap them inside a fragment. Okay, now to simulate an error, let's hit an invalid endpoint. So refresh. Now we get request failed with status 404. Of course, we can come back and improve the look and feel of this. We can make the error red, but let's not worry about these details at this point. We'll gradually improve this application as we go. And now the final step. We're going to review our code and make a commit to our Git repository. So here I'm going to say fetch the games.